Carli Velocci, what is your favorite game?
My favorite game is Silent Hill 2. Weird because, you know, most people say that they grew up with games and I didn't. Like I had like a PS2 and a Game Boy when I was younger, but my parents didn't really know anything about games, so they didn't really get me any. I had like maybe I think I had Kingdom Hearts, Grand Theft Auto 3, and then like some really terrible Mary-Kate and Ashley and Sabrina the Teenage Witch games, and that was about it.
Oh god, I'm so sorry.
They didn't know. I didn't know any better. It's excusable in a way. So and I like didn't really have any friends that were into games either, so I didn't like have a community or anything to be like, Carli, you should play this, Carli, you should play that. And that didn't really happen until like college when I started playing games, and it was kind of just being exposed to people who had played games, and they'd be like, oh, Carli, you haven't played, you know, Resident Evil 4, what is wrong with you? Carli, you haven't played Silent Hill 2, what is wrong with you? So I had a lot of help in like the first 3 years of college. Just a lot of people just throwing games at me, letting me borrow their consoles, just, you know, being excited that, you know, they got to share their favorite games with me. And honestly, like I think the game that solidified my new budding interest was Silent Hill 2, which is why and one of the reasons why it's one of my favorite games. But it's also just because, like, I can get into this later, but it just kind of changed the way I looked at games and changed my perception of them, and just like really got me into thinking about like how the games are made, and just more complexity in, you know, how these games work, and just like, yeah, just kind of opened my eyes. And then I just kind of went on a little bit of a binge, just trying to get every game I could get my hands on, buying all the used games I could on borrowed consoles. And right now it's still kind of a race to catch up, but also play all the new games. So there are a lot of games that are missing in my lexicon. Like, for example, I didn't really play that many Nintendo games when I was a kid. I think I played like Mario Kart, and that was about it. I didn't really play like any of the, you know, the really popular franchises, like Metal Gear Solid, you know, just came out their new game, and I have never played any of them, so I don't share the same excitement as everyone else. So it's given me a very unique perspective, but it's also putting me in a very interesting position where I feel like I have to play all the old games and the new ones.
No, that's actually quite fair. That's fair. Like I was never really into Nintendo myself as a young kid. I was more PlayStation really, and if anything,
yeah,
a bit of a Sega boy as well, because of my brother, who really got me into games in the mid-90s. He was playing Sega Saturn. He was playing stuff like Sega Rally, the FIFA games that were coming out at that time, or the football games that were coming out at that time. I don't know if they were necessarily FIFA, but whatever.
Yeah.
It's interesting the timeline you got on the games, because like everyone who's come on here, like it's been around the 80s, 90s, something like that. There, like it's safe to say that your timeline would start around the early 2000s, mid 2000s, anyways.
Yeah, like 2000, like 2008, a little. Like 2007, a little bit before that, but mostly it was like, yeah, like 2008. So like one of the first games I ever completed was like BioShock, because that had just come out at the time, or not too long before that.
Yeah, that would have been a year. That would have been a year or so, yeah.
Yeah, so I got into games basically as that was happening.
You're a Boston native, right?
Yeah.
And
well, not a native, but I've been here for a while, like 7-8 years.
Oh, okay. Like, there's plenty of Boston dev talent in the city, anyways. Like, there's Harmonix, and there was Irrational as well, who made
Yeah.
Bioshock. So like, there's plenty of dev talent there. I know it's.
Yeah, that's kind of one of the reasons why I started writing about games was because there is such a very not it's not a large dev community, but it's a very interesting and varied dev community. So I kind of hooked on to that, and that's how I got interested in like writing about games more than just playing them.
So with that in mind, like, I asked how you first got into the industry side of things, though.
It was kind of that, but it was I hadn't because I was in school for journalism. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I didn't really want to do any reporting or writing. But at an internship I had, they were looking for, just a whole bunch of different writing. And I was like, well, there's some devs that are like game devs that are around here that nobody really talks about. Maybe I should write about those. So I started writing about, I think like, I'm trying to think of who the first indie studio I talked to. I think it might have been Subatomic, who does Field Runners. They're in Boston, and not too long after that, there was the Boston Festival for Indie Games. So I went there and met a lot of the other like small independent studios and game makers. And so I kind of became a little embroiled in the local development community. And so I kind of started like reviewing some of the local indie games, talking with some of the devs, just getting more and more into games as an industry. So it kind of sort of happened just by accident, just kind of being like, well, there's this kind of section of Boston that nobody's ever really reported on. Let's report on that. And it kind of became my beat at that internship. But of course, it was an internship, didn't pay. So I went looking for other more paid opportunities. And that's how I started writing for more outlets, just kind of pitching my way, from, really small outlets to bigger outlets. And just like, yeah. And as I, learn more about games, it's kind of been an exponentially more complex industry to talk about because, as my knowledge grows, the more things I have to write about, and the more I look back at my old writing and see how, naive it is. Because I didn't have like the games background to pull upon in a lot of ways. So my writing definitely is a lot different than it is now, where I have more of a background and more of a knowledge of the history of games. Because I think games culture and history is very important to how we think about games now. So I've been trying really hard to catch up because of that. So my writing has changed, and like, things I cover have changed as I learn more. But essentially I started because I realized there was a sector, of the city that nobody was talking about. And as I got into those, I learned more. So it was kind of as the place I was interning, learned more about games, I also learned more about games. So it was kind of a simultaneous learning experience for a bunch of people.
Do you think that kind of late start in writing compared to, let's say, most other people who's been on the show, like, did that actually help you, or do you think, or was it rather of a hindrance?
I feel like it's more of a hindrance, although most people tell me that it's not. It's just more me feeling slightly insecure about, well, I haven't really played any of the Super Mario Brothers games. I haven't played Sonic. I haven't played, all these other games. And it's hard to catch up with games, especially because most games are like, you need the console to play it. And most consoles are like, I'm poor. I can't afford all the consoles, especially even like used ones. So it's definitely been like, well, I would love to try out this game that everyone talks about, but I can't because I need, an original PlayStation or a Nintendo 64, and that would require me buying them and then buying the used games. So it's definitely financial reasons that have kept me a little bit, what I feel, stunted, although that's just me talking. I know that's really not as much of a hindrance as I think it is, because I think at the very least I don't have a certain nostalgia that other people have, which means I can look at certain things in a different light. Like I can definitely look at, Pokemon games in a different light because I only really played Pokemon Blue as a kid and that was it. so I don't have like a connection, but that also means I can explore for the first time, which is, which I think is just as good.
Let's move on to your favorite game then, Silent Hill 2. Like you mentioned beforehand, like you were playing Resident Evil 4, so it's like safe to say you were playing horror games before Silent Hill 2. Like you were playing Resident Evil 4 and Silent Hill 2 in college, but like, were you much of a horror fan beforehand?
Oh yeah. I you see, I grew up in the '90s, so I had a lot of like the TV shows, the horror TV shows for kids, like the Goosebumps and the Are You Afraid of the Darks that really kind of hooked me really young. So when you see me like being 5, 6 years old, and watching like all these like vampire stories and ghost stories, and I loved horror books. There were a bunch of horror books for kids, like the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark with the terrible, horrible drawings in them. I had like a couple of those, and they were so scary, but like even more so when I was like 6 or 7 and still scared of the monster that was under my bed. But I don't know, there's something alluring about those horror tropes and those stories. Like I loved ghosts. I loved the idea of witches and psychics. I got into that stuff more in a metaphysical sense when I was about 10 or 11. And like it's funny, I can't think, about 8 or 9, I saw Ghostbusters for the first time. And I was like, Mom, Dad, I really want to hunt ghosts. And they got me like a really stupid like ghost hunting guide from the bookstore, but it was like for kids. But it was just, I found it a couple weeks ago when I was going through my bookshelf at home, and it's just, oh, it's so corny and ridiculous. But it's just kind of like, it reminded me that like, when I was a kid, I loved the idea that ghosts existed and that other stuff, like, witches and vampires, that all stuff that could exist outside. So even if like horror was too terrifying for me, I still latched onto it in a way that was like kind of more out of curiosity. And so of course, as I got older, I watched more horror movies, catching up on like slasher films. And, when I was around 15 or 16, I started watching more like kind of like old classic silent horror films and like B movie films from like the 50s and the 40s. And like, it's weird now because I'm not as terrified as I used to be, because I've seen so much horror that it's almost kind of like I've become desensitized to it a little. Like there was one time when I was with some friends, we went to like a haunted house, and I was basically just like going into every room and pointing out like, okay, in about 5 seconds, a guy's going to pop up behind there. And then that dummy is actually alive. And then we're going to go down here, and it's going to be scary because there's going to be a guy who's going to reach out from you underneath the door. Just like basically predicting everything that was happening, because I've seen so many horror films, and it's all kind of like, they all kind of go by beats. But it was, so it kind of seemed natural that I would hook onto games, because like when I played Silent Hill 2 for the first time, I was like the first time in a really long time that I felt like legitimately like terrified and horrified at something I was, experiencing, whether it was like, a book or a movie or a TV show or whatever. So I started playing, more horror games after that. And there's something so different about playing horror games versus like watching a horror movie. But they're very similar in a lot of ways. And games just seemed kind of like an extension for me of that curiosity I had about, do ghosts exist? Do vampires exist? And it just it's kind of like a natural progression for me. And it was kind of a, not a very surprising thing that nowadays I'm very much into, horror as a genre.
What was it like kind of getting into, like you mentioned, like how as you were getting older, you were getting more and more into the heavier stuff, because obviously as a kid you were getting into the more usual tropes of ghosts and witches and all that there. Like, but what was that like, starting to get into more of the heavier stuff, like the psychological aspect of the genre? Because that's what pretty much Silent Hill 2 is.
Yeah, like there's obviously a huge difference between, like, you have like maybe an Are You Afraid of the Dark episode, where, you go to a haunted house and you meet a ghost kid and you find out why the ghost kid died and then you free the ghost kid. And they're very simple stories, but terrifying for children. But then later you have certain things like Nightmare on Elm Street, for instance, because I've been thinking a lot about that lately because of Wes Craven's death, and also because 2 days before he died, I watched it again. But there's definitely something underneath just, ooh, there's a scary guy in your head. There's an innate fear there about dreams and about basically your own mind kind of turning against you. So when I started seeing that there are these different complexities in horror, it became more interesting, because horror as a genre is always more about, not necessarily about the monsters, but about what the monsters mean. So it's definitely more you have say you have Invasion of the Body Snatchers, for instance, which is about pod people, but in the 50s, when the book was really popular and when the movie came out, it was about, communism. And then you have Godzilla and the kaiju movies, which are about fears of nuclear weapons and, science and technology. So there's always some kind of historical and cultural aspect that is part of a good horror piece. And there's usually something there that kind of makes it well, why is this terrifying? Why is, why is Freddy Krueger so terrifying? It's because, he's not just a monster. He's a monster that lives in your head, and you can't fight what's in your head. You have nightmares all the time. Everyone has nightmares all the time. But what if those nightmares killed you? Especially when you find out that Wes Craven was inspired because people were dying in their sleep, and that's just no. So I like the idea that the more mature horror becomes, the more it becomes less about ooh, this is a spooky ghost, and it's more about, well, what does this ghost mean, and why are these people interacting with the ghost in a certain way? And it's basically, it becomes way more, and it's more interesting, and it's more interesting for analysis purposes, because as a critic, I love reading way too much into stuff. So it kind of just plays on that a lot. So for me, it makes a lot of sense that, I would be really into something like Silent Hill 2, because it's so much more than, a typical horror monster game.
The typical bad in numbers horror game, essentially.
Or, yeah, a typical, Silent Hill 1.
Have you played Silent Hill 1 at all?
Yeah, I played 1, 2, and 3. I haven't played 4. I've played Downpour. I haven't played it specifically, but I've seen Homecoming played. So I've experienced, I should say, a bunch of them.
What about PT? Have you played or seen any of PT?
Yes, I don't have a PS4, so I couldn't play PT, but I've seen many people play. I was really excited for Silent Hills, and then it got canceled, and I was very upset. For obvious reasons.
A lot of people were upset, it's safe to say.
Oh yeah, exactly. I wasn't the only one. It's Silent Hill is a franchise that, I have such a contentious relationship with, as do a lot of people, but it means so much to me and has so much potential to be so interesting. Downpour seemed like it kind of was kind of a start in the right direction, to be honest. And then, Silent Hills had Guillermo del Toro attached, and he's one of my favorite creators right now of anything. And so it's just, it was a huge disappointment.
Especially considering when PT, like you said, it had Del Toro, one of the masters of horror, and Kojima, who is, for me, easily one of the best developers who can break the fourth wall of games, basically. Yeah,
I haven't played any of the Metal Gear Solids, but I can understand why they're so important for gaming, and even just not having played them, I still find some aspects of them very fascinating.
What were your initial impressions of Silent Hill 1, going back to that then?
Well, I actually played Silent Hill 2 first.
Oh, yeah.
But Silent Hill 1, I played it, I think my friends and I would play 2, and then 3, and then 1. Which is weird. I understand. But 1 is one is not a terrible game at all. It just kind of doesn't hold up very well. But it's still kind of pretty creepy, and you can definitely see how later games have drawn from it in a lot of ways. So, it's very kind of a messy, rough game, but I don't. That's not really so much of a problem considering when it was made and considering it was the first of a series. But then you look at how much they improved upon that formula, and you realize that like all the basics were there already.
Like it was dated basically.
Yeah, it's dated. I mean, if I had played it, in 90, I don't know, 7, whenever it came out, I would have a completely different opinion of it. But I played it in 2009, so I'm like, oh man, Harry looks terrible. Why don't these people move? Why do these people move so weirdly? Why does it keep running into walls? These controllers don't make any sense. But I think the story is really interesting, even if it is kind of confusing and a little dense with all the cult stuff. That's the same with Silent Hill 3 too.
I mean, like I have this same issue with the original Metal Gear Solid. Like, if I had played it the year it came out, I think it was 98, 99 or something, I would have a completely different opinion of it. But because I only played it in 2009, and I only got into the series for MGS2 the year it came out in Europe, which was 2002, I want to say. Like, because I played MGS1 so late for the first time and finished it for the first time so late, I only finished it for the second time just last month as of recording this. So,
okay,
like, if I had played it around the time of its release, then I probably would have a different opinion of it. And it's... I can... Never mind, we're kind of getting off point here with Silent Hill, but I can easily see your point about Silent Hill and how dated that is, but at the same time, respecting aspects of it even now, so I can totally definitely see that. So Silent Hill 2, it has Team Silent have said at the time that there was a heavy story influence from Toystovsky's Crime and Punishment. Have you read Crime and Punishment at all?
I haven't. I know enough about it because I was an English literature major, but yeah, I haven't read it.
Okay, fair enough. But as well as Crime and Punishment, like they said as well, an art style influence from David Lynch, David Fincher, and Hitchcock, and these kind of all this kind of mashup of well-known influences, like that obviously helped the game, clearly.
Yes.
How would you say those would have helped the game? Like, in what way would you say?
Well, I mean, it's impossible to have anything that's not influenced by something else at this point. And I think they were just drawing on things that inspired them. Like, I find David Lynch very kind of interesting from an artistic perspective and a creative perspective. Like, I love Twin Peaks. And there's obviously a whole theme there surrounding like the idea of a small town that runs throughout all the Silent Hill games that is very reminiscent of Twin Peaks and other David Lynch movies like Blue Velvet, which all kind of have this surround this idea of like the small town with a dark underbelly, which is another one of my favorite like themes and motifs in literature and media and anything. But I think a lot of it has to do with just, I don't know, 100% the history of Silent Hill 2. I don't know where they came up with the story. But you can obviously see that they were inspired by other things and they took those things, kind of created their own thing out of them. And there are so many things now that I compare to Silent Hill 2 on its own, even if Silent Hill 2 is, based, inspired by other things. So it's kind of you can say that, Silent Hill 2 takes some inspiration from, David Lynch, but then you can say other things took inspiration from Silent Hill 2. So I think they just, kind of took what they knew and either improved on, what they knew already or combined it with something else to make, something else completely. Yeah, and it's its own unique thing. Sometimes I read stories that have nothing to do with games, and I call them Silent Hill 2-esque. It's become for me in my head, it's become its own definitive term that describes a certain kind of story.
Like Silent Hill-esque has kind of become its own influence in a way.
Yeah, exactly. it's gone up there with like, I'm inspired by Alfred Hitchcock, I'm inspired by, Wes Craven, I'm inspired by David Lynch. It's like I'm inspired by Silent Hill.
Hmm. That's a interesting way to put things. I like that answer. So let me touch upon then perhaps the two main characters of the game, James and Mary, or Maria even. So, like, how are your feelings of James as a main character then?
I love James Sunderland. I realize he's not perfect, obviously, because he's a terrible person. He's a very terrible person, though, more so than some other people.
Okay.
But I like him as a Silent Hill protagonist because he adds to this idea of the uncanniness of Silent Hill. Like, when I first played Silent Hill 2, or like any of the other Silent Hills, but especially in Silent Hill 2, people don't act normally. They don't act like the way people normally would when confronted with, like, a creature that looks like it's stuck in a straitjacket, or, a mannequin with four legs. Or, it's just like, when he looks at the hole in the wall and he's like, I'm going to stick my hand in that. Or like, there's a hole in the floor, I'm going to jump down it. And he doesn't act like a normal person acts. Nobody in the game does. But I think that adds a lot to the kind of surreal nature of the game itself, and just how it's supposed to look like it's our world, but it's not. So, like, I didn't like it at first because it was very kind of jarring, but now I kind of appreciate it as almost, I don't know if it was intentional or not. It could just be a localization or, time issue. But I do think that, like, it adds to this sense that the game is taking place in a world that is very much like our own, but isn't. And so it basically, it almost adds to the power of the ending.
Compared to like other protagonists in the series from the games you've played, like Harry, James, and Heller, like which of the three would you prefer? Like James, I would say, clearly.
Yes and no. I mean, I like James as a protagonist in the Silent Hill 2 universe, but say if I was like stuck in a horror game, I would want Heather. She's way more interesting from a personality standpoint. And just how she reacts. She reacts to things in a more appropriate way than James does. But I think James works as a protagonist in the Silent Hill 2 game specifically because one, the game's about him, and two, he works definitely more like a blank slate without, erasing a character too much. Like, you can have like a blank slate, like, Gordon Freeman, but I think for me, he's too much of a blank slate. While James is like, he has just enough character traits and personality to add to make the game work, but it's not too much that you're like, this is James's story. Like Silent Hill 3 is Heather's. Like, it's Heather's game completely. Silent Hill 2, he has James, but you also got Mary/Maria and Angela and like all these other characters that like kind of all like add up to the story together. So I think he's just right.
What about Maria/Mary? I'm like, what were your feelings of her then? Like,
it was really funny the first time I played Silent Hill 2. I didn't catch the fact that they were like, they look so much alike, because honestly for me it's a graphics thing. Because like facial, like faces tend to look very similar. So I didn't really like think about it too much as like they were supposed to be the same. But as the story went on, it's like this sense of dread that just grows in your stomach. Well, especially like the more Maria shows up and the more like weirdly she acts, and how she's like sort of some of Mary crosses over into Maria, and just that scene where she's talking to James in the jail cell is one of the, like, my heart stopped in like during that scene. So, and I think that like, yeah, she's a character. She, like, I don't even know if you can call her a character because she's many characters in a way. And she can change depending on, what ending you're going for and how you play the game and how you see James. Like, because she's completely different on the first playthrough than when James's deal on the second playthrough,
Oh, yeah.
But I think that, Maria/Mary is like, she's such an interesting foil. for James, especially when she becomes Maria. And it really builds up this like idea of sex and tension and like that basically pervades the game throughout. So I think she like her dialogue's a little clunky sometimes, but I think that's to do more with like dubbing and like translation more than anything else. So, but yeah, I think that Maria slash Mary is she's almost like the villain, but she's not. So she's very complex.
Like when you first played it, like did you catch on almost immediately that Maria was kind of more of a sexually provocative kind of character in a way?
Yeah, like it's kind of drilled into your head when you first meet her that she's supposed to be like kind of like the sultry like woman, like she's got like the printed skirt and the high boots, and she's like flirting with James the moment she meets him, even though he's like Mary, and she's like, no, I'm Maria, and she's like flirting with him, and it's kind of like almost uncomfortable in how like sexual she's meant to be, especially towards James. It's almost like over time she becomes less sexual as like the more you kind of learn to understand James as a character. She becomes a little less sexual. I'm not sure if it's like the writing or if it's just because you become more used to it, or just like, well, obviously she's this sexual because James is, really starved for attention. But yeah, so it was pretty obvious from the beginning that she was supposed to be a very sexual character.
Going back to James, like I want to touch upon Pyramid Head in a second because, like, Pyramid Head is perhaps
it's Pyramid Head.
It's Pyramid Head, exactly. But I was watching a video just before we were just chatting, and to kind of paraphrase the video, like James is emotionally inept right now as you start Silent Hill 2, because obviously he's lost Mary, like she's gone, and now and anything that James wants, he just kind of wants it without any emotions to it, and that like being sex is one aspect to it, so to speak, but like also other aspects of it as well. I'm trying to kind of remember what was said in that video, but like, how was that kind of relationship between James and Maria and Mary, so to speak, in the game? Like, how was that for you? Like how did you find it?
I mean, it's very toxic. Especially when as you go along. Like in the beginning, you're like, you almost don't really think about it as a relationship in the beginning, because you're under let's say you go into the game not knowing about the end. Are we doing spoilers?
Oh yeah,
are we trying to avoid them?
Oh yeah. If you want to go for spoilers, go for it. It's serious. I can just put it in the writing in the post. Just go for spoilers.
Okay.
It's all on deck.
Okay, cool. I wasn't sure. So what was I saying? So when in the beginning, when you don't know anything, so you go in and you're like, oh, my wife is dead. But I get a creepy letter from her from Silent Hill. So, and you know that she's dead, and you're under the impression that this town is creepy because it's Silent Hill, and there's a certain kind of feeling you get behind the name, even if you don't know too much about the games. Silent Hill is a terrifying kind of Stephen King-esque town that's alive in its own way. So it's almost kind of a non-relationship because Mary doesn't exist. And then Maria comes in and something's up, something's really off. You're not quite sure what it is yet. So you're kind of still like looking at it from a distance in a way. Like you don't want her to follow you, but she does. You don't want to protect her, but you do. And then you leave her in a room and you're just like, this seems like a terrible idea, but okay, I'm going to leave you in a room now. And it's definitely more interesting on the first playthrough, but because when you find out that it was James who killed his wife and everything he had remembered was wrong about her death, then it takes on this completely different idea where like, why did you see this as a non-relationship if he if this whole thing was his fault? And it's kind of almost like you say, like how James is so social, emotionally inept. And then you realize that like it's almost like he's pushing away those emotions for a reason. Um, and when you think about the fact that like she was sick for a long time, and he was trying to cope with it in his own way, and everything that he does kind of makes more sense. But then you also don't want to really sympathize with James because he killed his wife. So it's very complex, and it's like you realize that as much as Mary's kind of portrayed as like this sweet, innocent, almost kind of chaste, creature compared to, Maria or what James wants. But over time it becomes more dangerous and more, it's definitely a very toxic relationship. Like you don't get that on first playthrough because of how kind of like dead inside James is, but over time you realize just how like horrifying it actually all is, and it's not even, doesn't even have anything to do with like monsters or creepy fog or anything. It just has to do with, James's, frustrations and his fears.
There's a kind of another aspect to the relationship that I actually kind of found out on the dev side, at least, and it was in terms of influence, that I kind of want to bring up. According to the first, this is from the first scenario, I think. I'm going through a bit of it now, but there was for the first scenario run through of the game. In the original scenario, even like Maria's other personality, Mary, like it was a reference to Jack the Ripper, and actually Mary Jane Kelly, the last victim of Jack the Ripper, while James was Joseph, who was one of the suspects being Jack the Ripper. Like what do you think about that? Is that an apt comparison?
And this is like something that like the dev said, or is it?
This is apparently from the original scenario.
I mean, it definitely, like, it's kind of like I didn't really get that, but that's because it's very much ingrained in the culture of Jack the Ripper. But I think it makes sense when you think about, obviously we don't know 100% what Jack the Ripper's motivations were for killing all the women, but if you talk about it, you say take James, put him in like that role, for instance, and it becomes all about sexual frustration, then it kind of adds a bit of like monstrosity and dangerousness to James as a character. Like, because you can read it as like, well, dealing with his wife's illness was just as taxing on him as it was for her, but at the same time, he did kill her, and that's a terrible thing, and he should not be treated with any sort of respect because he did an awful, terrible thing. And that's why he's getting put through hell, literally and metaphorically. So yeah, I guess that makes sense in a lot of ways.
Let us touch then on Pyramid Head. What do you think about? What are your feelings on it as an enemy, then?
I mean, he's not really an enemy, is he?
That's what I wanted to touch upon as well. but what were your initial feelings on it?
He's a giant guy. You first see him, doing something horrible to a mannequin, and you have no idea what's happening. And he just follows you around, and he's got this horrible, long, heavy knife. And he's just naturally very scary looking, and terrifying. And considering I played this in like 2008, 2009, when, memes about Pyramid Head had already kind of pervaded the internet a little bit, I had a certain image in my head. Was that image shattered
immediately after you played Silent Hill 2?
Yeah, it took a couple of tries actually, because the first time you play it, and there's so much to like metabolize about Silent Hill 2, but then you go down to the second time and you realize all the things that you thought Pyramid Head was doing, he's not doing. He doesn't actually like kill anybody, like really. He's not actually really a threat to you. You can't kill him, but because he kills himself. So it's very strange. Especially when you see that he's like kind of based on something that's supposed to be like a quote unquote guardian of the town, when you find in like paintings around the town and stuff. And where you realize that he's definitely more like James himself. He's supposed to be basically James, as, a manifestation of a monster, you almost like feel more sympathy for Pyramid Head than you do for James. Like it's funny. The more I play Silent Hill 2, the less I care about James, and the more I care about Pyramid Head. Like oh, Pyramid Head did nothing wrong. He's like it's terrible, just terrible. But at the same time, you realize that he's not what you think. And it's very interesting how they played that because it's very subtle.
It is very subtle. This was actually the video I was referring to just a minute ago. This was reported back in May. This was going around circles in May. But there was a video going around, and a YouTuber put forward a very good case on why, although it was fair to say everybody initially thought Pyramid Head was the enemy, Pyramid Head was actually helping you out. Or at least that was the theory that this video was going for. So that, yeah, and that Pyramid Head was helping you out all along, while somehow Maria was just basically working against you somehow. That not in the more typical "I'm going to stop you, her" trope, but more of a just something else, basically.
Yeah, you can definitely see it that way in a lot of ways, because Pyramid Head's almost trying to like enlighten James in a lot of ways. Like he's trying to be like, because like the whole entire game, James is in denial about what he's done, and when confronted with Pyramid Head, what he does is he tries to kill it, or he hides from it first, and then he tries to kill it. But then at the end, what Pyramid Head does is he kills himself essentially, and it becomes way less like he was. Like it seems way less like he was trying to hurt you than he was just trying to reach out to you in a lot of ways. Like he does hurt you if you can die from a Pyramid Head attack, but you can get his knife and then you can become Pyramid Head in a lot of ways, if you choose to use it. And then you have like Maria, who, I mean, it's weird because there's the, I don't know if you call it a DLC because it's not really a DLC, but like the extra game, essentially. The extra game in Silent Hill 2 where you play as Maria. If that puts a different spin on things because you realize she's sentient and she has her own thoughts and her own adventures before she even runs into James. So it's a little different when you have that in your head, versus if you just played Silent Hill 2 and you wondered the entire time if Maria is like this sentient being or if she's just a product of, the town, getting into James's head, and trying to basically lure him and seduce him. So I guess I can see how you can look at both those. Like we can look at Pyramid Head as like kind of a companion and look at Maria as an antagonist, especially because I definitely in a lot of ways see Mary/Maria as an antagonist, but not in the traditional way, obviously. Because obviously the real antagonist is you. But yeah, I think that holds some weight. I think Pyramid Head is definitely more than just a creepy guy with a long knife who, likes to do despicable things to other things.
I was going to bring up Born from a Wish as well, but I'll save that for towards the end. But there was another aspect of that video as well that really caught my eye, so to speak. Obviously Pyramid Head is personification of James, and that he is all the things that he wants, like power, sex, etc. But towards the end of the video, it was mentioned that maybe Pyramid Head was James's guardian angel as well, in a way, so to speak. Because James, it's because like I said, James is so devoid of feelings. He's dead inside, whereas Pyramid Head is the manifestation of all these things that that James wants. And here at the end of the video going, maybe Pyramid Head is James' guardian angel. I was like, what? No, this was initially at first, but like the more I thought about it, the more I realized maybe that's true. Maybe that's really true.
I think like just having the term guardian angel tagged onto Pyramid Head is strange, just because you see Pyramid Head as one way and then putting a metaphorical halo on top is a little jarring. But I think I don't think he goes so far as to be a guardian angel, to be honest, but I think in a lot of ways he is James's guardian. Whether he's trying to, lead James in a certain direction, which I think he is. And, he's kind of, and also if you think about it, like Pyramid Head doesn't have sentience of his own. He's a manifestation of James and Silent Hill kind of, clashing and coming up with something that's the personification of James's, frustrations about his own masculinity. But I think in a lot of ways that Pyramid Head is, I struggle to say that he's a guardian angel, but I also can't disagree with it because he never actively tries to fight against James like all the other monsters do. Like Maria is working against James in a lot of ways, and preying on his frustrations in a way that's almost exploitive, while Pyramid Head isn't really doing anything. He's actually very passive. He's a very passive character. Like he doesn't really attack you. He just kind of stands there, and he only really attacks you when you attack him first. Like one of the first times you see him, he's just kind of staring at you from like behind a gate, and you're just like, well, that's not okay. I'm just going to walk the other way. And then you see him as a monster, but he's really not. He's definitely more of a character that is just, it's like James looking in a mirror, to be honest. So it's not really like he's a guardian angel, but he's not he's not a villain either. I mean, if you think about like Silent Hill 3, where, the famous line, like, oh, they look like monsters to you. And like that always like rings in my head every time because it's for Silent Hill 3, but you can think about it in a Silent Hill 2 context in that you look at the lying figures and the mannequins and the pyramid heads and you're like, what are these monsters really? There's more to it than just monsters that are attacking you.
Like, besides Pyramid Head, like, there was obviously other enemy designs in the game, like the bubble head nurses, and like obviously there's a kind of disturbing scene with them with Pyramid Head in the game. But like, how did as a horror aficionado, let's say, like how would you feel of the enemy design in the game?
I mean, I think it works. Like obviously there's something often problematic about the way the nurses are drawn, but I think that's all to a point. There's obviously something there about like sexualization of women and how James probably looks at other women during his time trying to care for Mary and how frustrated he is like sexually, and he feels emasculated. So I think it makes sense when you think about it when you think about all these, if you think about all these monsters are manifestations of James's head from James's feelings towards the death of his wife, then it all makes perfect sense. Like the nurses are very sexualized, but it's not for the benefit of the player, even if some players, treat it as such.
Born from a Wish, you just brought it up then, the side story scenario where the player takes control of Maria.
Yes.
Before they meet in Silent Hill, they meet Maria and James. What did you think of that?
It's weird. It's definitely... I don't really understand like what the point of it is, to be honest. Like, it definitely brings more depth to Maria, but then it just makes things a bit more confusing. Because as much as I love the world of Silent Hill that's portrayed in Silent Hill 2, like which is a completely different Silent Hill than the ones in like 1 and 3, I think I also really like figuring out the way worlds work, and showing that Maria has these memories and had this whole experience before James, and that there are other people in the town, so to speak, is very kind of, well, that contradicts everything that I thought was going on in the main game. So it's just kind of very strange. I'm not really sure what to think of it, to be honest. I don't hate it, but it it makes me see Silent Hill 2 in a way that I'm not so comfortable with, because if Maria is a human being that was just kind of used by Silent Hill for James, isn't that kind of like awful in a lot of ways? That she had no agency whatsoever in what she was doing. So yeah, it has a lot of really horrible connotations, I think.
Silent Hill 2 is known for multiple endings. So, like, what ending did you get first time round?
I think we got the suicide. I think I got the suicide ending first.
Ah, so that's the one where he drives off the cliff, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I got that one first because the thing about I was doing all the things that you're not supposed to do, especially when I was stuck. I was like, oh, maybe this object will be helpful. Nope, it's not. But it turns out I was just looking at the knife over and over again, which is one of the things that triggers the suicide ending.
Another big core aspect of Silent Hill 2, and for more or less all the series through Downpour, up until Downpour, was Akira Yamaoka's soundtrack.
Yeah.
That I like. I can definitely respect and like that man's music. He really knows how to kind of bring out the best of that series in terms of music and sound design. Anyways, yeah, it's just so good.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, it's like almost perfect. Like I hate saying things are perfect because there's no such thing. But at the same time, you're in the hotel, and you get the three music boxes and you put them together and they play that like really haunting lullaby. And it puts you in a completely different place than you were before. Or when you're talking with Maria in the jail cell and you have that track playing over the really famous I'm totally blanking on the name right now, but when you have the track, yeah, and you have like that playing over, and you're just like it's, it hurts, it hurt, like you have the game and it's so terrifying, it's horrible, but it's also really tragic and it's very sad, and the music definitely doesn't let you forget that at all, and especially when you don't know the ending, it gives you a sense of like sadness and dread about what's to come that it just makes you want to keep playing and just makes the ending all the more just horrible. It's pinnacle of like and score in anything, I think.
Yeah, like I said, it's like what he does with the work he puts into that series, or he has put into that series, is great. Especially with Silent Hill 2 with female Laura, but quite frankly, you'd be hard beat. Do not find a better score or music theme for a Silent Hill game than Silent Hill 3.
Yeah, it's really good. It's good in all of them, to be honest.
Yeah, it is. It is. Like, you can't really fault any one game for bad music choice. No.
Yeah, exactly. It all adds so much to the game, and like what's so great about the Silent Hill games is that they're more than just straight up horror games. They're very psychological in a lot of ways, and you go into each game. Like you have a different emotion every time. Like every game you play has a different emotion tied to it. So, and I think they're all different in those ways, and they all kind of almost foreshadow what's to come towards the end without, making you feel really uncomfortable.
Have you played Silent Hill 2 through the HD collection at all, like on PS3 or Xbox 360?
No, I was advised not to.
That is a good call. That is a very good call. I was going to ask about the other kind of smaller aspects of it, because obviously Troy Baker comes in as James. But that is perhaps a good call. That's actually the only way I can play Silent Hill 2 now, because I have a copy of the HD collection on PlayStation 3, but at the same time I don't want to touch it.
I saw some footage from it, and it's so bad. So I never really listened too much at the different voices they brought in, or it was just them when you can basically see the edge of the screen in when he's rowing in the lake, and it's just why would you do that? Why would you put out a game that looked like that?
Exactly.
And I just can't. I refuse.
That's a good call. That's a good call. It's more or less the reason why I'm staying away from it. Just even if there's the odd creeping temptation now and then, just play Silent Hill 3 again.
Exactly. Like I don't own Silent Hill 3, and I would love to play it again, but yeah, I'm not buying that HD collection.
Fair cop, fair cop. It's good advice. Don't buy the HD collection, kids. No, just stay as far away as you can from it, as best as you can. So what else do you like about Silent Hill 2 that we've not really touched upon tonight?
I really like some of the side stories. Like I love Angela's story, especially. I like how there are all these other things going on while you're in it, so it definitely lessens the it's all about James kind of feel you get from it. But also I really like Angela's story because I mean it's so tragic and it's so sad, and you find out that like she's a victim of sexual abuse and abuse from her father. And honestly, I think her monsters, the abstract daddies, are the creepiest looking. The ones that are like, they're like I don't know how to describe them. They look like somebody lying on top of someone else. And it's so creepy the more you look at it. And I love like the fight with her in like the room with all the, just like I can't even like describe it properly how much I love Angela as a character. And I love how she basically how she overcomes or doesn't overcome, depending on how you look at it, her past and her like all her horrible traumatic experiences. And it's interesting because she's put in this like AK like personal hell for for arson, but it's all very understandable. So it really adds another dimension to how she feels about what she's done to her family. Like, despite the fact that her family has caused her so much pain, she still feels really guilty about it. And it's not like, so it's not very straight, like black and white kind of story. Like James, he killed his wife. That's terrible. And Eddie he killed a dog. Not nearly as terrible, but still very terrible. But Angela's is definitely more ambiguous, which I really liked. And I liked how they put that in there.
What else do you not like about Silent Hill 2?
Like I mentioned this before, but the controls are really terrible. It's like, especially because it was one of the first games I played. I got stuck so many times. I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. This combat is terrible. Like it's not very fun to play from a controller standpoint. Until you get like really used to the controls, and then it becomes easier. But yeah, the controls are a little messy. And that's basically how it's been for every Silent Hill game. They've all been kind of clunky in like how they move and how they, show combat, and so it's a little distracting in that way. Like it's really bad in Silent Hill 1, but in Silent Hill 2, where you're just like James keeps running into walls. He can't walk downstairs properly because he's not facing them exactly right. It's kind of silly. It's kind of silly and ridiculous.
It's kind of disorienting in a way.
Yeah, it's a little.
Top 3 Silent Hill games. What would you put in that list? Obviously, 2 would be at the top. I would say 3 and 1.
2's at the top. I really like 3 as the second one, and for third place, I like 1. I mean, I also kind of really like Shattered Memories too. I didn't mention that before, but I've played that, and I really like what it does with 1, like how it retells it. So I guess it's a tie between 1 and Shattered Memories.
Honorable mentions, then. Go for it.
Well, I love the Mass Effect series.
Who doesn't?
Exactly. I was going to say that's nothing surprising or controversial to say. It's wonderful.
What game would you say is perhaps your favorite of the series, then?
I'd say 2.
Everyone says 2, and
Yeah.
rightfully so too.
Yeah, like I like 3, but 1 was a little tough to get through.
Yeah.
It took me a few tries to get like my exact shep so that I wouldn't die all the time. Um, but yeah, two also has just the best story and the best companions. And my first playthrough of two was tragic, but in a way that made it more interesting because I kept trying to romance. I was femshep, and I kept trying to romance these characters I couldn't romance as femshep. And it was so frustrating, and I was so upset about it.
Oh dear. Oh dear. Like who were you trying to romance?
I kept trying to romance Jack,
That
but
no, no, that's not too bad.
it's not. But at the same time, you can't romance her as femshep, which is
No.
stupid. Which is very, very stupid because she's canonically bisexual.
Yep.
So that's why I was like, oh, I could totally try and romance you. And then after a while, I'm like, wait a minute, nothing's happening. Uh-oh. I screwed up.
I think for me, like I played as femshep as well, and my femshep was bisexual as well. But I didn't really try anything in one. But for two, I was with Chambers, and then for three, oh god, I'm blanking on her name, but like who was your assistant in three again? I can't remember.
I'm totally blanking too. Sorry.
That's basically who I had in three because my femship likes to play the field basically.
Uh-huh.
But I like whenever anyone compares between, let's say, whoever was in three and Chambers in two, I always say Chambers, man. Always like Chambers.
Yeah, but in the end, it turned out that, Liara's my space wife forever because I romanced her in one and then I ended up romancing her in three. And Garrus is my space bro because we're best friends. And I totally support him and Tali as a couple. Thumbs up. She's a wingman. My femshep's a wingman.
Which kind of makes Citadel and Mass Effect 3 very interesting as well.
It's a little interesting.
With I never had I think Tali died in two for me. She did die for me in two, so I didn't really pair them together. But I think it was Garrus Animus, and he's in the bar, and you have to try and set him up with someone. And it was just hilarious. I mean, like Citadel's basically a hilarious but emotional caricature of a piece of DLC. I love it.
Oh, it is, but I love it so much, and I just love making Garrus feel really embarrassed in general. I know you're supposed to like treat him well, but I'm like, no, I'm not gonna let you win. Okay, so there's a bunch of going back to my love of horror as a genre. There's a lot of like really interesting free to play freeware horror games that I love. I love them so much. I love like SCP Containment Breach. Even though it's such a simple game with very simple graphics, it's so terrifying. And it's the one if you or anybody in the audience doesn't know, it's the one where you have that statue that that stays still when you're looking at it, and then if you blink or you're not looking at it, it can kill you. Very much like the Weeping Angels in Doctor Who. But it's so nerve wracking. It does horror so well because the entire time you have no idea what's going to happen, and you're just like, I've been playing on my computer, and then something happens, and I just throw my mouse off my desk because it really gets you in a state of absolute fear and terror in a way that doesn't feel cheap, which is really important. Because I definitely feel that a lot of times horror relies on certain tropes, and it kind of cheapens the scares a lot. Like, it's like, oh, well, of course that was going to scare me. It was a shitty, terrible jump scare. But, SCP Containment Breach really deserves it and really earns it's just how scary. Oh, it's so scary. And it's free, which is great because I'm poor and I love free games because I can play them and then share them with other people, and then they will play them because they are free. Another game I really, really like is Off, which is another free-to-play game, and it's horror in a lot of ways, but it's also just kind of a psychological RPG in a lot of ways too. Yeah, and it kind of became like a viral hit for a while, which is how I found out about it. But it's very interesting. It's very, like I said before, how I described the term Silent Hill-esque. It's very Silent Hill-esque in a lot of ways. Um, in that it's about, like kind of like crime and punishment and morality. And it's such a simple game, but so creative. And that's another one. Trying to think what else is there. I would say those two.
Top 3 games ever. What would you go for?
3 games ever. I mean, Silent Hill 2 for one.
Okay, obviously.
Obviously. Crap. I have no idea. I would say Walk to the Moon would be, not Walk to the Moon. To the Moon. That's it. I was thinking of the band Walk to the Moon. To the Moon, I really like. It made me cry, and I've played it a billion times, and it's wonderful. And then I guess my third would probably be Borderlands 2. It's so much fun, and it does character really well. Yeah, you can just play it forever essentially, because so many things to explore, and it's so fun, and you can play with so many other people. Oh, and I guess I should also say Portal.
Yes, Portal is amazing.
Portal and Portal 2 side by side.
Would you be able to choose one of them as your favorite? Let's say, he says kind of manically.
You say that manically because it's terrible and hard. I would say 2 only because you go to the moon. It has that edge.
Go to the moon and then have the game To the Moon in your top 3. Well done.
I try. Well, firstly, I run a very small quarterly magazine. It's called Postmodern Mag. We publish work by creators and artists and anybody else who has had a creative experience and wants to talk about it. And you can find that at postmodernmag.com. And we have a Patreon that you can donate to if you're interested in seeing artist reflections and, writing on the creative process. And that's at patreon.com/postmodernmag. And then you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is Velocci Raptor, which is my crowning achievement. Coming up with that. And I freelance all around the web, and you can find my writing on my portfolio, which is carlivelocci.wordpress.com.
Silent Hill 2 is known for multiple endings, so what ending did you get first time round?
I think we got the suicide. I think I got the suicide ending first.
So that's the one where he drives off the cliff, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like no way in all were you trying to get the dog ending?
Well, you can't get the dog ending on the first run through, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you can only get it on after you've finished it once. Same with the UFO ending, which you can only get after you've played it once, which makes perfect sense because why would you be playing a horror game with saying you have no knowledge of it whatsoever, and then all of a sudden you find out that a dog was behind it the entire time?
Well, that would be a twist and a half.
It would be a little weird. So,
お前の仕業だったのか。
of course, I've seen it. It's wonderful in every way. It's the best ending in any game ever. Yeah, it's not appropriate for a first Silent Hill playthrough.
No, 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 definitely not. But anything after that is fair game.
Exactly. Like when you're playing Silent Hill 3 and then you get like magical girl Heather as a costume. Like it's stupid. But obviously you're playing it a second time, so it's okay.
Doggy. Um, Thanks for listening to my favourite game. Next week, Tom Francis on Deus Ex. Until next week, bye bye.